May 13, 1846. News of war reached Rome, Tennessee along the same dirt road that carried wagons of corn and tobacco toward the nearest river town. And on that day, the man the community knew as Dr. Thomas J. Hodges listened with the rest as riders said that the United States now stood in open conflict with Mexico. Rome was a small settlement in Middle Tennessee, set among low wooded hills and narrow creeks that fed into the Cumberland River system. Its streets were rutted tracks lined by a few stores, a tavern, a blacksmith shop, and scattered houses. Around that core lay farms held by families who had pushed into the region in the early decades of the century, cleared timber, planted grain, and built the fences that marked their claims. The town existed to serve those farmers with tools, cloth, salt, and a place to settle disputes. The Hodges family belonged to the class of people the county regarded as solid and respectable. They owned land, kept up with their obligations, and appeared in court records and church notes as steady participants in community life rather than as defendants. Thomas grew up in that setting during years when the frontier line had moved farther west. But everyday life still required the same hard work that had shaped the first cabins and fields. His parents expected him to reflect credit on the family rather than draw shame on their name. From an early age, he showed enough aptitude with reading and numbers that his parents steered him towards schooling rather than full-time field labor. The local schoolhouse was plain with plank benches, a stove for winter, small windows, and a battered blackboard. A single teacher drilled boys and girls of different ages in the basics, calling them up by level to recite lessons and solve problems while the others worked with slates and primers. Thomas moved through those lessons quickly and developed the habit of careful listening that later served him in more demanding classrooms. Books in the Hodges home strengthened that path. In addition to a family Bible and almanacs, there were a few volumes of history, basic guides to health and anatomy, and other works rare in poorer cabins. Evenings after chores gave him time to read by lamplight while his parents talked quietly about crop prices, tax notices, and county politics. The combination of farm work, which taught endurance, and steady reading, which opened a wider world, began to shape a young man who did not see his future limited to the fields around Rome. In that period, the southern states still produced many of their physicians through apprenticeship and a patchwork of lectures rather than through long formal programs. But even that level of training cost money and required family support. When Thomas reached the proper age, his parents and local mentors helped arrange for him to pursue medical study under established doctors and at medical schools that accepted students from Tennessee. He left Rome for months at a time, traveling by stage and riverboat to towns where lecture courses drew together young men with similar ambitions. The teaching he received fit the standards of the day. In lecture halls that smelled of lamp oil and preservatives, instructors demonstrated bones and organs on skeletons and anatomical specimens. Students copied diagrams, memorized lists of symptoms and treatments, and watched as faculty showed how to tie off arteries, set broken limbs, and amputate mangled ones. Dissection was controversial and not always possible, but when bodies were available, he stood close enough to see how layers of tissue connected and how easily a slip of the knife could ruin a delicate procedure. That work hardened his nerves and trained his hands. Not every student endured the sight and smell of opened flesh and the reality that every cut carried risk. Some left medicine altogether. Thomas stayed. He learned to hold a blade without tremor, to listen to instructions without letting his attention wander, and to think in terms of what would preserve a patient's life. Examination and certification followed, and when he completed that process, he carried back to Tennessee the credentials and confidence of a young physician ready to build a practice. Physical descriptions that circulated later in his life began to apply even then. He stood taller than most men around him, broad in the shoulders with a strong frame and a face made distinctive by a prominent nose and intense eyes. He wore his hair long enough to separate him from ordinary farmhands, and he dressed with the plain but orderly care expected of a professional man who visited homes in times of crisis. In Rome, his appearance announced that the community now had its own trained doctor rather than relying entirely on folk remedies and distant towns. Rural practice demanded constant travel. Once he set up in Rome, Thomas bought a reliable horse and began to learn every lane and byway in the district. Families sent children to run for him when sickness struck, or they sent riders to find him at home or at the tavern where he sometimes took his meals. He packed his instruments, medicines, and notebooks into a leather bag and rode out in heat, cold, rain, and dust. The work did not pause for season or holiday because disease and injury followed their own schedule. The cases he handled covered the entire range of frontier life. Some days he treated simple fevers, toothaches, and minor injuries from tools. Other days he arrived to find a child with a raging infection, a man crushed by a falling tree, or a woman in labor that had gone dangerously long. Cabins were crowded, airless places when illness struck, with relatives and neighbors gathering around the pallet or bed. In those rooms, he learned to give clear directions, demand space when needed, and make decisions with limited information and no time to hesitate. His practice seldom brought large fees because many patients had little cash. Payment came in the form of chickens, sides of meat, barrels of grain, or written notes promising settlement after harvest. What he gained instead was influence and trust. People spoke of him as a man who had left the county to learn a difficult trade and then returned to use it in their service. Parents pointed him out to their children as evidence that discipline and study could lead to more than a lifetime behind a plow. Those years also taught him how authority worked in a small community. When he entered a cabin in response to a desperate summons, even stubborn farmers who disliked being told what to do listened as he ordered firewood gathered, water boiled, bandages prepared, and anxious relatives moved out of the way. He saw how fear could turn quickly into obedience when someone appeared who spoke with confidence in the middle of confusion. That understanding would matter years later in very different circumstances. But in Rome, it served only to strengthen his reputation as a capable doctor. Beyond his immediate practice, events in the wider nation moved steadily toward conflict with Mexico. Newspapers that arrived in Tennessee carried reports of disputes over the border of Texas, clashes of patrols near the Rio Grande, and speeches in Washington that spoke of honor, territory, and national standing. Men read those columns aloud at the tavern and on courthouse steps. The conversations mixed local concerns with distant names and places, but over time one message became clear. The United States was moving toward war, and if war came, Tennessee was expected to send volunteers. Officers and politicians in the state understood that any volunteer regiment needed surgeons as well as line officers. Young doctors with proven training became natural candidates for those posts. As talk of war grew louder, people in Rome began asking whether their doctor would go if a regiment formed. Thomas answered that if Tennessee called for medical officers, he would serve. The answer matched community expectations. Service in such a position promised honor, experience, and pay that his modest rural practice could not match. When Congress formally recognized that a state of war existed, the news arrived in Tennessee by mail and word of mouth. Notices went up calling for companies of volunteers. Drums and fifes began to sound in larger towns as recruiting officers assembled men. Rome felt the pull of that movement. Young men discussed enlistment over drinks and across fence rails. Older men weighed the loss of labor on their farms against the pressure to contribute sons to the national effort. Women considered how they would manage if husbands or adult sons marched south. In that climate, no one was surprised when Thomas arranged to join a Tennessee volunteer regiment as a surgeon. The position suited his skills and offered a clear rank in the military system. preparations in his household took on an organized urgency. Instruments had to be wrapped, clothing repaired, accounts settled, and instructions given to whoever would handle matters in his absence. His parents faced the prospect of seeing their only son leave again, this time not just for study but for battlefields where bullets and disease killed quickly. Neighbors came by in the days before his departure to say farewell and to entrust him with messages and names. Fathers asked him to keep an eye on specific boys if they ended up in the same command. Mothers thanked him again for the times he had helped their families and asked him to write if possible. The conversations were plain and practical, but beneath them rested a shared understanding that some of the men gathering under Tennessee flags would never return, and that even those who did would not come back unchanged. The morning he rode out of Rome, the town took notice. He wore travel clothes suited for rough service and carried with him the tools of his medical work. His horse moved at a steady pace along the road that led toward the assembly point where companies were forming. People paused from their work in fields and yards to watch him pass. Some raised hands in brief gestures of respect. Children stared at the figure who had so often arrived at their homes as a bringer of help and now left as part of a larger force. Behind him lay a life that up to that point fit neatly within the expectations of his community. He had been a dutiful son, a diligent student, a competent rural physician, and now a surgeon headed to serve in a national war. Nothing in his conduct suggested a man who would later lead armed bands, plan ambushes, and defy officers and judges instead of working under their authority. On that May day in 1846, as he followed the road away from Rome, his neighbors saw only a trusted doctor answering a call to duty. The war he rode toward would expose him to a scale of violence, suffering, and disorder that no Tennessee cabin had ever contained. It would give him practice in making life and death decisions under pressure far beyond that of a crowded sick room. It would place him in an institution that rewarded courage and punished failure, but also exposed the hidden weaknesses of men who, on quiet streets, were described as perfectly respectable. Those experiences created a direct line from the respected Dr. Hodges of Rome to the man who would later be known across California as the outlaw called Tom Bell, although no one in his home community could yet imagine that transformation. 1846 to 1848. The camp where the Tennessee Volunteers gathered was a churned field of tents, stacked crates, and restless men, and when Dr. Thomas J. Hodges arrived with his saddlebags and instruments, officers saw immediately that he would not be standing in line with a musket, but working under canvas where the wounded would be carried once the regiment reached Mexico. Muster rolls lay on makeshift tables while clerks shouted names and sorted men into companies. Around them, recruits practiced loading and firing under the eye of sergeants who had fought in earlier conflicts. Wagons creaked in and out with food, ammunition, and medical supplies. In that noise, the surgeon's work began before anyone fired a shot because disease and accident did not wait for formal battles. Men already came to him with infected blisters, fevers, swollen joints, and the stomach complaints that came from crowding and bad food. He inspected the tents that would serve as his hospital, checked the bandages and bottles issued from the quartermaster, and examined the few surgical instruments the state provided. Much of the finer equipment he had brought himself. Bone saws, scalpels, forceps, probes, needles, thread, and tourniquets filled a chest that would travel wherever the regiment went. He watched how the companies drilled, memorized the locations of their tents, and noted which officers had the authority and temper to keep their men in order when sickness or wounds struck. The march south toward the Mississippi River showed him how quickly an army could consume its men even without facing the enemy. Some volunteers fell out with exhaustion and had to be carried in wagons. Others were sent home when persistent fevers made it clear they could not endure the campaign. At every halt, Thomas set up under a tree or in a clearing to lance boils, drain abscesses, treat dysentery, and comfort men whose first contact with war involved nothing more dramatic than watching their strength drain away in a ditch. When the regiment reached the river and boarded steamboats bound for New Orleans, he faced another set of problems. Crowded decks and close air turned minor ailments into serious threats. Men unfamiliar with river travel vomited, fainted, and lay in piles of blankets along the rails. He moved among them with a basin in one hand and a cloth in the other, washing faces, checking pulses, and keeping the worst cases away from the healthy as much as the cramped conditions allowed. The steamboat cabins smelled of sweat, coal smoke, and sickness. In New Orleans, the regiment joined a mass of other units passing through the city. Streets near the docks filled with uniforms, vendors, wagons, and droves of mules. The heat pressed down on everyone. Official orders sent the Tennessee men onward by sea to the Texas coast, where they would join the forces operating under General Zachary Taylor. While officers met in shaded rooms to discuss routes and timelines, Thomas walked the harbor, spoke with other surgeons, and confirmed that his regiment would receive no extra supplies beyond what they already carried. He would have to stretch every roll of bandage and every bottle of medicine. The voyage along the Gulf of Mexico on a transport ship was rough and uncomfortable. Men packed into the holds grew seasick and short-tempered. Latrines overflowed. The surgeon and his assistants scrubbed what they could, burned soiled rags, and tried to enforce simple practices like boiling drinking water and washing hands. Compliance was never perfect. Some volunteers ignored instructions and then came to him with cramps, vomiting, and fevers not long afterward. He kept notes because patterns of illness mattered as much as the spectacular wounds that everyone expected from battle. At the Texas landing, the Tennessee regiment disembarked into an environment very different from the woods and hills of their home state. Low brush, exposed sand, and long stretches of flat country met their eyes. The march inland toward the Rio Grande region took them through settlements damaged by earlier operations, fields stripped of crops, and roads rutted by artillery and supply wagons. Dust hung in the air and settled into every fold of cloth and every open wound. Thomas saw quickly that keeping injuries clean would be more difficult here than in Tennessee. As the regiment entered the zone where Mexican forces might appear at any time, the surgeons positioned their equipment closer to the front. Before each engagement, Thomas selected a spot sheltered as well as possible from fire, usually behind a ridge, a building, or a grove of trees. There he and his assistants laid out instruments, basins, bandages, and blankets. The first time he heard the sustained crackle of musketry moving across a field toward his position, he felt the human instinct to duck. But training and habit kept his hands steady as he waited for the first stretchers. They came quickly. Men staggered or were carried in with shattered limbs, torn flesh, and bleeding torsos. He examined each in turn, working with the principle that those who could be saved with prompt intervention were treated first. Tourniquets went on above mangled limbs. Assistants cut away clothing. He probed for bullets, removed fragments, and prepared patients for amputation when bones were smashed beyond repair. Sawing through a limb required both strength and precision. He learned to ignore cries and focus on finishing the cut cleanly so that the stump could be shaped and dressed for the best possible chance at healing. The ground under his feet turned slick with blood and spilled water. The air filled with the mix of iron, sweat, gunpowder, smoke, and the sharp tang of preservative liquids. He did not pause to consider the larger tactics of the battle. That belonged to officers on horseback in the distance. His task was to keep as many men alive as his skill allowed. When shells or stray shots landed near the hospital position, he shifted only enough to ensure that the next wounded man could reach the table. During one heavy exchange, a fragment of masonry thrown by a cannonball or an exploding shell struck him across the face. The blow broke his nose and dropped him to one knee beside a patient. Blood poured from the injury, but after a brief daze, he pushed himself upright, pressed cloth to his face, and returned to work. The deviation of the bone never healed back into its original line. From that day forward, his nose carried a flattened, crooked look that everyone around him noticed. It marked him as a man who had stood close to incoming fire. Between battles, the surgeon's work did not ease. Camps around Monterrey and later near Buena Vista turned into breeding grounds for disease. Men drank from contaminated streams, ate poorly cooked food, and lived in close quarters. Diarrhea, typhoid, and other diseases rolled through the regiments. Thomas walked from tent to tent inspecting patients who looked as if battle had already passed through them, although they had never seen the enemy at close range. He prescribed rest when possible, simple diets, laudanum for pain, and the limited remedies available for intestinal infections. Many survived, some did not. He watched how discipline in camp shifted as the months wore on. Fresh regiments had marched with straight lines and rigid obedience. After long periods in the field with irregular pay and constant discomfort, many men grew careless. Gambling tables appeared in corners of the camp. Whiskey moved in barrels and flasks despite regulations. Fights erupted. As a medical officer, Thomas treated the broken knuckles, cut faces, and bruised ribs that followed. He learned that respectable farmers and clerks from Tennessee could, under pressure and boredom, behave like any rough crowd in a frontier town. In evenings, when duties allowed, he sat at tables himself, watching cards slide across boards and coins pass from hand to hand. He saw how some soldiers made small fortunes and then lost them in a single night. He studied the expressions of men who thought they were winning, the tension of those who knew they were in too deep, and the way small cheats slipped into play. Observing those games showed him that money could change hands far faster through risk and nerve than through steady wages or farm revenues. Supply trains that fed the army also caught his attention. Wagons loaded with food, ammunition, clothing, and pay chests had to move along known roads through hostile territory. Escorts rode beside them, but attacks, delays, and confusion were constant threats. He listened to officers discuss routes, guards, and timetables. They worried about ambushes, broken wheels, lost mules, and the ever-present chance that enemy forces or bandits would strike. Without realizing it, Thomas was absorbing detailed knowledge about how organizations moved valuables through dangerous country and what measures they used in an attempt to protect them. He also saw the limits of authority. Orders issued in neat handwriting from headquarters did not always match conditions in the field. When supplies arrived late or not at all, soldiers and officers adapted. They took what they needed from the surrounding countryside, bargained with local residents, or went without. Disease sometimes killed more men than musket balls, yet reports to superiors carried only numbers and short phrases. The gap between official language and the reality he saw under hospital tents taught him that institutions could look solid on paper while fraying badly at the edges. The battles themselves left deep marks in his memory. At Monterrey, he watched men advance and fall among adobe walls and narrow streets. Wounded soldiers came back with dust embedded in their wounds and pieces of shattered brick driven into their flesh. At Buena Vista, he saw columns disappear briefly into smoke and then reappear in ragged lines, some missing friends who had marched beside them. The wounded told him in halting words between operations what it felt like to stand in open ground while artillery and musket fire tore holes in their ranks. Each engagement reinforced habits that would stay with him. He learned to keep his voice level no matter how urgent the situation became. He prioritized tasks instinctively, directing assistance with a glance or a short instruction. He adapted quickly when a planned hospital site turned out to be exposed or unusable. These skills belonged at first to an army surgeon, but they also formed the foundation for later leadership of small groups of armed men who would depend on his judgment in sudden violence along stage roads. When peace negotiations advanced and the war drew toward its end, the Tennessee Regiment prepared to return home. Men who had survived both battle and disease thought of farms, shops, and families waiting in the States. Some had gained nothing but scars and memories. Others carried pay saved from months of service or the loot they had taken when occupying enemy territory. For Thomas, the ledger of the war contained thousands of cases treated, countless operations performed, and entire days and nights spent without rest. His hands were surer than when he had left Tennessee. His view of the world was wider and harder. The journey back reversed the route that had brought them south. Marches carried the regiment away from the Mexican interior to embarkation points. Ships took them along the Gulf to New Orleans, where they disembarked once more into crowded wharves. Steamboats carried them up the Mississippi, and then overland routes brought them back toward their home state. At every step, he continued to treat fevers and lingering wounds. Men still died on the way home, proving that the end of formal combat did not erase the dangers that had followed them for 2 years. When at last the regiment reached Tennessee and disbanded, communities welcomed their soldiers with music, speeches, and crowded gatherings. Dr. Hodges returned to Rome with the crooked nose, scarred knuckles, and lined face of a man who had seen more of death and suffering than most residents could imagine. Neighbors asked him about battles and officers. Families of those who had not returned asked quiet questions about final illnesses or last messages. He answered as truthfully and gently as he could, knowing that every detail he shared would fix itself in the minds of those who listened. He resumed civilian practice in the familiar countryside, riding again along the roads he had known as a young doctor. Yet the contrast between his former life and what he had experienced in Mexico was sharp. The intensity of field hospitals, the constant movement of men and money, and the presence of both official and unofficial violence had left deep impressions. He knew now from direct observation that disciplined armed men could be turned toward goals far outside the narrow expectations of a small town, and that institutions charged with maintaining order often struggled to control events. Those lessons did not instantly transform him into an outlaw. For a time, he remained what he had been, a physician working among the people of Rome. However, the war had permanently altered his sense of what was possible. He had seen lives taken and saved in moments. He had watched fortunes move in wagons and on gaming tables. He had learned how fear and respect could be directed by a calm voice under pressure. All of that traveled home with him, invisible to the neighbors who greeted him as the same Dr. Hodges they had known before the Mexican-American War began, 1849 to 1853. The years after the Mexican-American War did not restore Thomas J. Hodges to the same frame of mind he had carried out of Tennessee as a young doctor. He had returned to Rome, resumed house calls and sickbed work, and listened again to the sounds of livestock, mills, and small-town arguments. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside he carried the memory of crowded transports, battlefields, and long lines of men standing in ranks under orders. When stories of California gold reached Tennessee in greater detail, they did not sound to him like distant curiosities. They sounded like another theater where men, money, and risk concentrated in one place. Letters and newspapers from the West described fields littered with men chasing fortunes in the Sierra Nevada, and camps where physicians could charge strong fees for every hour spent treating injured or sick miners. The accounts mentioned that a skilled doctor could fill a purse in a single season if he set up in a busy district. They also noted that gambling houses and saloons lined the streets of the larger camps, and that card tables and faro layouts took in as much gold as any claim. Those reports reached Rome's tavern and general store counters, where men read selected passages aloud and backed them with private talk of relatives already gone west. Thomas understood that every day spent riding to scattered Tennessee cabins brought only small payments and fading memories of the command he had exercised under canvas hospital tents. California offered a different scale. The decision to leave took shape quietly, formed of fatigue with small rewards and a sense that another upheaval would not be as jarring now that he had already seen war. When he finally announced that he would go, the town treated it as another ambitious move by their doctor. People spoke of him setting up among the miners, treating them, and perhaps coming home again with enough money to stand above the uncertainties of country practice. He closed his accounts as cleanly as he could, arranging for other physicians in nearby towns to take over urgent cases once he left. He sold what he did not need and kept only the instruments, clothes, and books he could carry. The farewell this time carried less ceremony than the departure for war. There was no formal regiment, only a man stepping into the stream of thousands heading west. Yet for his patients the break felt sharper, because the war had seemed like a duty for a fixed term, while the move to California looked open-ended. The journey west used the common routes of the gold rush, combining river travel, crowded steamships, and rough overland sections. At each stage, he joined groups of strangers united only by the promise of gold ahead. On deck and along trails, he listened to men describe their plans, which ranged from digging their own claims to selling supplies, running card games, or opening small businesses. He kept his own plan, plain. He would practice medicine in the diggings, use his experience to treat injuries and diseases that any mass of men produced, and take advantage of the high fees that scarcity of doctors allowed. Conditions during travel stripped away any lingering attachment to the gentler features of Tennessee life. Heat, bad food, close quarters, and the constant presence of illness around him felt familiar after the army. But for most emigrants, they were a first taste. He patched minor wounds, offered advice to those who asked, and watched others attempt to doctor themselves with patent medicines and folk cures purchased before departure. The further west the party traveled, the more the talk centered on the first view of California hills. The rumored richness of certain streams and the names of towns that had grown in only a few seasons. When he finally set foot in California, the first strong impression came from San Francisco. The city had grown quickly from a small port to a sprawling, uneven place of tents, shacks, hastily built wooden buildings, and crowded wharves. Ships lay packed in the harbor, some abandoned by crews who had gone to the mines, others serving as warehouses or lodging houses. Streets climbed steep hills thick with mud or dust depending on weather, choked with wagons, drays, and foot traffic. Saloons, gambling halls, boarding houses, and supply stores stood side by side. He did not intend to stay long in the city. His purpose lay inland, where miners worked claims far from established institutions. With others headed in the same direction, he followed routes up through the river valleys toward the diggings in the northern mines. The journey into the Sierra foothills brought a different landscape than either Tennessee or Mexico. Oak and pine-covered slopes cut by streams that ran fast in the melt season and wore deep channels into the rock. Canvas tents, log cabins, and rough board structures lined the banks wherever a pay streak had been found. In those camps, he found immediate demand for his skills. Miners crushed their hands between rocks, broke bones in falls, inhaled dust that set off lung problems, and suffered from dysentery, scurvy, and fevers. They also drank heavily, fought over claims, and staggered into medical tents or crude offices with knife wounds and gunshot injuries. He established himself in one town, then another, renting or building simple quarters where he could examine patients and store his instruments. Word spread that a trained doctor was present. Men who had gone without care for weeks or months lined up when they saw that someone knew more than simple home remedies. Payment came in the form of gold dust measured on scales, coins, or promised shares in claims. The amounts varied, But even modest fees piled up more quickly than in Tennessee because cases came in almost continually. In a busy period, he barely slept, moving from one cot to another, cleaning wounds, setting fractures, and prescribing rest and better diet whenever food supply allowed. He kept a serious demeanor, demanded that patients hold still during procedures regardless of the pain, and took grim note of infections that advanced despite his efforts in a country where no adequate hospitals existed. The same camps where he worked by day changed character at night. Saloons filled with miners freed from the day's labor. Lamps burned behind stained windows. Music, loud talk, and occasional shouts poured into the streets. Gambling tables operated under every roof that could support them. Faro layouts, Monte games, roulette wheels, and card tables pulled men away from their bunks and into rooms where fortunes shifted with each turn of the cards or spin of a wheel. He entered those rooms first as an observer, but the atmosphere repeated what he had seen in wartime camps and on transports, only compressed and intensified. Gold dust made every bowl and cup deeper in value. Men who had spent a week knee-deep in cold water washing gravel now carried their stakes in belt pouches or small buckskin bags. They stepped to the tables with faces lined by work and expectation. Some played cautiously, placing small bets and retreating when they won. Others pushed their entire week's take into play, chasing a sudden leap from ordinary miner to man of substance. He watched their hands, their nervous habits, and their reactions to loss. The setting appealed to parts of him that had taken shape when he saw how quickly money moved in army gambling tents. At first, he gambled with restraint, using small sums risked at the end of busy days. The quick tension of the game felt like a release after hours spent in close rooms with injured men. His knowledge of human behavior, sharpened by medical practice, helped him read some opponents. He could tell when a man sat down already near a breaking point, or when another held a winning hand and tried to keep his expression neutral. The more he played, the more he believed that careful attention and nerve could turn the odds in his favor. As months passed, the balance between his medical work and his time at the tables shifted. The steady sight of gold dust pouring into other men's pockets while his own earnings went into rent, supplies, and basic needs wore on him. He began to think of gambling as a way to add to those earnings instead of a mere pastime. More nights ended with him still seated by morning, his eyes bloodshot, his medical coat draped over a chair while cards and chips moved back and forth across the table. Losses mounted. Even a skilled player could not guarantee steady success in games designed to favor the house or the dealer. Streaks of bad fortune ate into his savings. He borrowed from acquaintances who respected him as a doctor and believed his promises to repay quickly. He paid some back, others not. Debts shifted from casual loans among colleagues to obligations noted by men who made their living extending credit at high rates to desperate gamblers. Those men had no interest in his past service or education. They enforced repayment with threats, and in some cases with actual violence. The strain showed in his practice. There were days when he arrived late to see patients because he had spent most of the night under saloon lamps. His hands still held steady during operations, but his temper shortened. He snapped at assistants and lost patience with men who failed to follow his instructions. Some miners noticed and began to mutter that the doctor cared more for faro banks than for sickbeds. Others who owed him their limbs or their lives continued to defend him. The divided opinion reflected the split in his own life between healer and gambler. As his gambling deepened, he drew closer to the rougher element in the towns. Owners of saloons and gambling houses watched him and saw someone who brought respectability to their rooms. Guards and hired toughs who moved through the crowds keeping order for a price treated him with a familiarity they rarely offered to other professionals. He learned their names, heard their stories, and picked up details of fights, robberies, and claim disputes that never appeared in official records. That circle regarded violence as an ordinary tool, no more unusual than a shovel or a pick. He also saw firsthand how gold shipments moved out of the camps. Stout wagons and pack trains carried dust and nuggets down the mountain roads toward banks, express offices, and coastal cities. Armed riders accompanied them, but the route from a remote camp to a stronger settlement always ran through stretches of forest and canyon where no lawman had a permanent post. Men in saloons spoke openly about recent robberies on those roads. They named drivers, messengers, and guards who had been surprised and disarmed. The conversation was not theorizing. It came from people who knew how thin the line of protection could be once wagon wheels started turning. Meanwhile, his own financial situation pressed harder. He had grown used to a certain scale of living with decent clothes, regular meals in boarding houses, and access to the liquor and companionship that the camps offered. Once debts increased and patients paid slowly or in uncertain shares of claims, he began to feel a continuous pressure that did not ease even when he won at a table or received a heavy poke of dust for a difficult operation. Every gain seemed to vanish into obligations already standing in line. Moves from one camp to another did not solve the problem. In town after town, he set up to practice, made a name among miners, and found his way back to the gambling rooms. Sonora, Columbia, and other northern camps each added their layer to the pattern. For a while, he might keep himself disciplined, playing only small stakes while focusing on building a patient base. Then a run of good outcomes in one night would tempt him to raise his bets. A run of bad outcomes would wipe out savings and send him deeper into debt than before. The respect he still held among many miners and merchants masked the extent of his trouble. They saw a doctor who had fought in war who could amputate a crushed limb without flinching, and who still answered calls in bad weather. They did not see the account books that no longer balanced, or the creditors who waited at saloon doors to catch him on his way out from a table. For some, he remained the image of stability in a chaotic environment. Others, closer to his private affairs, began to whisper that he was overextended and on a path that could not hold. Fights connected to cards and unpaid obligations became more frequent. Once, a dispute over whether a bet had been placed before or after a card turned ended with a fist striking his cheek and a pistol appearing in another man's hand. By that point, Thomas no longer stepped back from such confrontations. He was used to the proximity of death from war and from the operating table. In saloons, he gave threats and received them with a flat expression, as if he were discussing a medical procedure rather than the possibility of somebody getting shot in the street. These years in the goldfields reshaped him more thoroughly than even the war had done. In Mexico, he had seen violence within a formal structure. In California, he watched it tied directly to money, drink, and personal grudges, with little oversight from any higher command. He still practiced medicine, but now he moved with ease among men who lived by their wits and by intimidation. The line that had once separated him sharply from that crowd blurred with each new debt and each fresh confrontation. By the early 1850s, he stood at a point where ordinary remedies for his situation no longer existed. Honest practice could not erase what he owed fast enough. Gambling had taken more than it returned. His knowledge of how money and gold moved through the camps and along the roads was deep, and the men he spent time with included those who already thought in terms of taking rather than earning. Under that weight, the respected doctor from Rome, Tennessee, found himself edging toward decisions that would cut him loose from any remaining claim to a straightforward professional life and carry him into the world of organized theft that waited only one step beyond the saloon door. In the first months of 1851, Sacramento County depended on mule trains. Long strings of animals moved between the river levees, freight yards, and the muddy roads that led to the goldfields. Grain, tools, salt pork, canvas, liquor, and passengers all moved on their backs, and every hoof brought money. In that crowded maze of corrals and loading yards, Thomas J. Hodges reached the point where talk and promises no longer kept his creditors away. He still kept his surgeon's instruments in a leather case, and he still answered when a miner staggered in with a crushed hand or a drunk gambler arrived with a knife wound. The men who came to him in back rooms above Sacramento's saloon still greeted him as Doc and trusted his hands. They did not notice the way his eyes followed each mule string that passed the window, or the way he counted the animals as carefully as he once counted a patient's pulse. The gaming tables had taken his savings, and the steady work-patching wounds did not match what vanished in one long night of cards. He knew the owners of several mule strings by name. They sat with him at the same bars, paid him to lance infected blisters, and spoke freely in his hearing of the risks of moving animals through a town filled with desperate men. Out on the edges of the yards, picket ropes rubbed raw against cottonwood trunks, and night watchmen who had worked too many shifts leaned against fence rails with heavy eyelids. One such string belonged to a trader whose animals were destined for mining camps higher up the American River. 11 sturdy mules stood in the same rough pen night after night, waiting for hired drivers to finish their gambling and drinking and haul them north. The trader spoke often of those animals within earshot of Hodges, complaining that his drivers delayed their departures and boasting of the price they would bring once they reached the hills. Hodges listened and kept his thoughts to himself. When the theft came, it happened with the simplicity common in that harsh town. Under cover of darkness and noise from the waterfront, the ropes on the trader's mules were cut, and the animals were led out through a gap in the fence that had not been mended. The street lamps along the levee cast uneven light, and no one stopped a tall man who walked at the head of a mule string. Freight animals changed hands constantly, and no passerby could tell which driver belonged to which string. By morning, 11 mules were missing, and the trader's anger followed the news from saloon to stable. Men who depended on their animals' strength understood what such a theft meant. Livelihoods in that region rested on teams that could survive bad trails and storms. When 11 sound mules disappeared in one night, owners up and down the river took notice and watched their corrals with new suspicion. The animals had not been driven into some hidden valley. In a region where livestock ownership often rested on a brand and a bill of sale, it did not take long for men on horseback to trace the missing mules. Fresh tracks led away from Sacramento, and reports spread that a matched string of animals had been sold at a suspiciously low price. Questions followed, then armed riders, and the trail pointed back toward the man known as Doc Hodges. The arrest did not unfold on a dusty street in front of a mob. Officers who had heard of Hodges's growing debts came with warrants and support. They took him into custody as a charged thief, not as a respected doctor. The indictment was grand larceny, and the evidence was plain. The stolen animals had been found, the sale had been traced, and the buyer knew exactly who had stood before him with the lead rope in hand. Miners who learned that Hodges, the same man who had stitched them up after knife fights and accidents in the diggings, now sat in a cell on a grand larceny charge, reacted with open disbelief. Camp acquaintances in Sacramento and along the river had trusted his education and his record of service. The knowledge that he had moved from private gambling losses to a crime that struck directly at other men's means of earning a living shook that trust in a way no unpaid card debt ever could. In October of that year, the grand larceny case moved from rumor to formal punishment. On the 8th day of the month, the court ordered Hodges into the control of the young California state prison system for a term counted in years. He became one of the earlier prisoners recorded under the new statutes, a case noted because so few men had yet passed from county jails into the state's direct custody for serious crimes. State prison in 1851 did not yet mean a finished fortress of stone and iron. For men like Hodges, it meant confinement aboard ships and in county jail cells that the legislature had designated as temporary state facilities. The same rivers that carried gold seekers inland now held hulks where prisoners slept in cramped quarters below decks, chained together so they could not slip overboard into swift water and darkness. During the day, guards marched them ashore to clear brush, haul stone, and work under the eyes of civilian contractors who had agreed to manage the state's growing population of convicts. Hodges entered that world as a man with formal schooling, a rare background among prisoners whose entries in the state register mostly listed simple laboring trades. He shared space and restraints with men convicted of robbery, assault, and forgery. The iron around his ankles did not weigh less because he could recite medical terms or recall the layout of army field hospitals. Inside the prison system, he did not stand apart as a healer. He stood among convicts numbered and described for bureaucratic records. Prison officials recorded him in their ledgers and then moved him like any other man. At one point, he sat in a county jail that doubled as a state penitentiary. At another, he was transferred, with other convicts, to the prison brig Waban, a wooden ship that lay off Angel Island when the authorities needed floating cells. At night, heavy chains kept men from attempting the cold water between the hull and the shore. During the day, they marched under guard to labor in quarries and on construction work that fed the growing appetite for stone in California's towns and military posts. The routines on board the prison ships removed the identities men had held in the mining camps and towns. Guards addressed them by numbers. Food came in rough portions carried along crowded decks. Sleep meant lying close to other men, listening to chains clink with every movement. Discipline for attempted escape or disobedience was physical and public, meant to remind every prisoner that the state held power over his body to the same extent that chains limited his movement. News of Hodges' conviction reached the camps where he had once practiced. Men who had trusted him with their injuries shook their heads around campfires and in tent hospitals thrown together along riverbanks. Some cursed him as another scoundrel who had hidden behind education and fine speech. Others pointed to his fall as proof that the goldfields and their temptations could pull even an army surgeon away from the path he had once followed. Whatever conclusions they drew, they now spoke of him as a convict, rather than as a doctor. From the state's perspective, Hodges was one more name in a growing list. California's rapid growth after statehood had filled jails with men who treated the law as something to dodge rather than obey. The legislature had turned to private contractors to house and control these prisoners, trusting them to do it cheaply and firmly. Under that system, escape attempts and harsh punishments both became part of daily prison life. Contractors pushed convicts to work harder. Convicts in turn studied routines, locks, and the habits of guards. Hodges watched that contest unfold around him. Men arrived in chains and spoke of robberies in the diggings or violent clashes in saloons. Some boasted, others kept their heads down. Transfers between the prison ship and the half-built stone works at San Quentin became ordinary. Every movement offered a small window when someone might misjudge a count or turn his attention away from a set of keys. Each such lapse created a chance for a desperate man. In March of 1853, prison records placed Hodges at San Quentin with a new prisoner number and a long term for grand larceny. The prison on the point was not yet the solid mass of walls it would later become. Prisoners themselves were building it, quarrying rock from the surrounding hillsides and hauling it into place under guard. They cleared land, raised guard quarters, and laid the foundations of cells they would later occupy. Work details left San Quentin each morning under escort. Lines of striped clothing and clanking chains moved down to the quarries, Guards rode or walked along the flanks, rifles in hand. The men at the front of each line could see the water and the free hills beyond. Close in distance, yet separated from them by rifles, watchful eyes, and the knowledge of what awaited those who were caught running. Escape from such a place demanded planning, nerve, and a willingness to face lashes, irons, or worse, if the attempt failed. Hodges labored within that harsh structure through years when illusions about his standing no longer held. He saw the timetable of the prison ships and the San Quentin work details. He saw which guards kept strict count of their men and which ones grew careless after long months of the same duties. He saw which convicts talked endlessly of escape and which ones quietly studied gates, tide lines, and the habits of those in charge. By the spring of 1855, the prison system held Hodges and other convicts in a network that spread from shore to ship and back again. Guards moved prisoners between jails, hulks, and the stoneworks on the point according to the needs of contractors in the state. Those movements created moments of confusion that no rules could entirely prevent. Wagons broke down, weather delayed boats, men were locked and unlocked in new places as officials tried to keep the system running. On the 12th day of May in 1855, Hodges acted during such a moment. While under state custody with other men, he took part in an escape that pulled him out of the state's direct grip. Convicts overpowered guards during a transfer, broke loose from the chains that held them, and disappeared from the immediate reach of the prison authorities. The system that had numbered Hodges and put him to work now had to enter him into a different column, one reserved for escaped convicts. The break did not erase the crime that had first sent him into the state's control, nor did it undo the shock felt by those who had known him as a doctor in the mining camps of California. It did, however, change his position in the world. He now stood outside the prison walls as an escaped state convict, a man with every reason to avoid ordinary work and ordinary company. From that day, he carried not only the skills gained on battlefields and in hospitals, but also the experience of life inside a harsh prison system, and the knowledge that the state would pursue him until it caught him or his life ended far from its custody. May 1855 to mid-1856. The escape left broken shackles in the dirt and a scattered trail of footprints that faded as the convicts pushed into the hills. And by the time the first organized search parties spread out from the prison works, Thomas J. Hodges had vanished into the folds of the California countryside as a wanted man with no intention of returning to a cell. The group that fled together did not move as a tight, orderly column. Chains had come off in a rush, blows had been traded with guards, and men scattered in small knots looking for any cover that would hide them from rifle sights. For hours they climbed and descended low ridges, cut across gullies, and splashed through shallow creeks, driven by the knowledge that mounted pursuers could appear at any time. Hodges kept close to one prisoner whose bearing and quick reactions impressed him, a man others called Gristy. Bill Gristy had come into the prison system from a different set of crimes, with a record that included stock theft and armed trouble in the northern counties. He moved with the confidence of someone who had slipped through tight spots before. Where others panicked and ran in zigzag paths at every sound, he chose his direction with care, steering toward thicker timber and deeper ravines. It did not take long for the doctor and the outlaw to recognize that they needed each other to stay free. Hodges brought a trained mind, knowledge of medicine, and experience organizing men under pressure. Gristy brought a practical understanding of ranch country, back trails, and the rougher class of miners and drovers who moved through the Sierra foothills. On the first night after the escape, when the fugitives had put several hard miles between themselves and the lines of guards, the two men ended up sharing a small campfire screened by a ring of boulders. Others lay nearby, exhausted and silent. In that cramped shelter, with the smell of sweat and damp wool hanging over the group, they spoke in low tones. Hodges knew that his name now sat in prison registers and lawmen's notices as a convict who had broken custody. He also knew that his face was burned into the memory of guards and officials who would pass along descriptions. Gristy, watching him through the smoke, suggested the obvious. The doctor needed a different name if he planned to move through towns and camps again. The name Tom Bell entered the conversation not as a grand invention but as a practical tool. There already existed a minor stock thief with that name, known in a few scattered districts. Taking it would confuse records and give the escaped surgeon a layer of distance from the respectable name of Hodges that still held weight among people who had known him as a doctor. Around that small fire, with fugitives shifting in their blankets, the man born in Rome, Tennessee, agreed to step into someone else's identity. From that point among the convicts, he answered to Bell as easily as he once responded to doctor. The first days of freedom were spent avoiding main roads and surviving on what they could gather or steal. The escaped men knew that the area around the prison would fill with mounted patrols as soon as officers could organize them. Hodges and Gristy angled away from the bay and its watchful eyes, aiming instead for the great interior stretch of hills and river canyons where mining camps still multiplied and law remained thin. The doctor's understanding of maps and the outlaw's memory of trails combined into a route that led them gradually toward the diggings in Yuba and Nevada counties. Traveling in small parties or singly, they moved through small settlements, keeping their heads down and their stories simple. Hodges cut his beard differently and adjusted his manner, trading the open authority of a recognized physician for the quieter bearing of a man who claimed to be a traveling doctor between jobs. In one town, he treated a child's fever for a family that did not ask many questions as long as the symptoms eased. In another, he pulled a splinter of metal from a blacksmith's hand in exchange for a meal and a place to sleep in the loft above the forge. These small acts of medicine served more than one purpose. They gave him food and shelter without drawing the kind of attention that open robbery would have brought too soon after the escape. They also reminded him that his hands still carried the skills of a surgeon, yet the gratitude in the eyes of the people he helped did not steady him as it once had. Every time a patient thanked him or offered payment, he felt the weight of the prison number tied to his real name, and the certainty that honest work alone would not soon lift the shadow of his past debts and his new status as an escaped convict. By the time he and Gristy reached the region west of Grass Valley and Nevada City, word of robberies on the roads and thefts in scattered camps had already made travelers cautious. The goldfields had never been free of crime, but rumors now spoke of organized bands instead of lone thieves. The area around Rough and Ready, with its rough cabins, scattering of boarding houses, dance halls, and saloons, offered both concealment and opportunity. Roads from several directions converged there, bringing pack trains, wagon loads of supplies, and travelers carrying pokes of dust. Hodges, now using the name Tom Bell among those he met, studied the town and its surroundings with the same attention he had once used to evaluate a battlefield site. He noted the narrow points where roads squeezed between rock outcrops or dropped into steep ravines. He watched where freighters paused to water animals, and where drivers relaxed their guard to drink or gamble. He paid attention to which merchants trusted banks and express offices with their gold and which ones kept heavy boxes in back rooms until they felt conditions were safe enough to ship. In saloons, he sat with Gristy and listened more than he spoke. Men at nearby tables talked about long stretches of road where they saw no patrols, about teamsters who traveled alone to save money on guards, and about merchants who refused to pay protection money to local toughs. Miners discussed rockfalls, floods, and claim disputes, but when the talk turned to holdups, one detail kept repeating. Most robberies on the road still followed a simple pattern, with one or two desperate men stepping out with pistols or a shotgun and demanding purses and dust. Few had seen anything resembling a carefully led gang. Gristy, quick to see how that gap could be used, pressed Hodges to move beyond small survival crimes. The escaped convict who had once traded in stolen mules now stood ready to recruit men for a different scale of theft. What he lacked was someone who could plan operations with care, choose the best ground, and impose discipline. In Bell, he believed he had found that leader. The doctor's experience in organizing medical tents and work crews under fire could, in Gristy's view, translate directly into leading road agents who needed firm direction when shots were fired and frightened travelers began to panic. Together, they reached out quietly to men who had reputations for toughness and who carried grudges against the world strong enough to push them past fear of the gallows. Some were gamblers who had lost everything and did not see an honest path back. Others were drovers or laborers tired of small wages who knew every bend in the local trails. Among them, names such as Ned Connor and Jim Smith began to stand out. Men who could ride long distances, handle firearms, and hold to a plan. Each recruit knew he was throwing in his lot with fugitives, yet the promise of gold dust taken at gunpoint outweighed the risk in their minds. Bell did not present himself to these men as a mere equal. He brought them into the circle with a clear understanding that he would choose the targets, decide when to attack, and settle disputes. His broken nose, serious expression, and the controlled way he spoke all contributed to a presence that commanded attention. When disagreements arose over division of spoils or the handling of captives, he shut them down with a tone that allowed no debate. The man who had once given orders over bleeding bodies now spoke of how the gang would move and how quickly they would leave a scene once the gold was in their hands. The first operations they undertook as a group did not involve stages. They targeted isolated travelers on the Yuba and Bear River roads, men who rode alone or in pairs with bulging saddlebags. Bandits waiting above the track would step out with leveled weapons and short commands. Those who complied walked away with their lives in empty pockets. Those who hesitated risked a pistol barrel swinging toward their chest. Stories of these robberies reached nearby camps in fragments. Victims staggered into Rough and Ready or other settlements, angry and humiliated, describing a tall man with a battered nose and several hard-faced companions. The name Tom Bell began to circulate in those retellings. Once simple holdups on the open road demonstrated that the gang could act together without stumbling over one another, Bell raised the stakes. The Yuba region held small stores that supplied outlying miners and ranchers. Many kept their cash and gold on hand rather than trusting distant banks. On a June evening in 1856, according to later tallies, a teamster heading down from the hills with a modest load found himself confronted by armed men who relieved him of a sum counted later as $145.75. The amount itself did not shake the region. Teamsters had been robbed before. What elevated the incident in the minds of those who heard about it was the impression that the men who did it were acting under orders rather than in a moment of drunken impulse. The victim noted how quickly they moved, how one man kept watch on the road, and how another covered him while Bell demanded the contents of his strongbox. That detail reached campfires and bar rooms along with the bare number of dollars taken. It suggested a pattern rather than an isolated act. A few days later, the same kept watch and swift movements appeared again when masked men stepped into a small establishment remembered as the Grizzly Store. By the time the owner and customers recovered from the shock of leveled guns and shouted commands, the intruders had taken the small store of cash, some stock in trade, and the gold dust on the premises. They left with a haul that would not have attracted notice in a San Francisco counting room, but meant much in a country where sums were built pan by pan. In both cases, the gang made a point of moving on quickly, leaving victims alive but shaken. Bell had no interest at that stage in leaving bodies behind unless the situation forced it. Killing drew passes more swiftly than theft alone. He understood that sheriffs with limited men and wide territories had to prioritize murder cases because grieving relatives and outraged citizens demanded action. Robbed teamsters might complain to local lawmen, but unless someone was shot, the pressure to track highwaymen over miles of broken country remained weaker. Even so, the stories stiffened the backs of officers in Yuba and Nevada counties. Notices tacked to walls and pine trunks warned travelers to go armed and to avoid lonely roads when possible. Newspapers in Marysville and Nevada City carried short items about robberies, hinting at a coordinated gang without yet naming a leader. Among the readers of those lines were men who had known Dr. Hodges in his earlier mining camp practice, and who now paused when descriptions of a tall man with a damaged nose and a habit of commanding others appeared in print. Some dismissed the resemblance as coincidence. Others watched strangers more closely when they rode into town. The contrast between how Bell's new associates saw him and how his former patients would have remembered him grew sharper. To his gang, he was the man who walked ahead of them when they went into danger, who selected ground where the curve of a road or the shelter of trees gave them advantage, and who divided spoils with an eye toward keeping resentment down. Around campfires in ravines and hidden clearings, they joked roughly, argued over card games, and boasted about women and past fights. But when he spoke, voices dropped and plans settled into place. To those who once shared cabin rooms with him as he set broken limbs and stitched cuts with care, the idea that this same man now pointed pistols at travelers created a kind of mental whiplash. Though most of them did not yet know that Tom Bell and Dr. Hodges were the same person, whispers and partial recognitions moved through the camps. A few remembered a doctor who had been fond of cards and who had vanished after trouble with stock theft. When they heard that a leader of robbers now operating near Rough and Ready used the name Tom Bell and carried himself with the assurance of someone educated and self-possessed, their unease deepened. Within the gang, Bell began asking for information about stage lines rather than single travelers or isolated stores. He wanted to know which express companies ran the heaviest loads, which routes carried strong boxes filled with dust and coins, and how many armed guards rode alongside drivers on particular runs. Gristy and the other men provided details from their own experiences and from what they heard in saloons. They spoke of the Camptonville and Marysville route, of strong boxes packed for coastal shipment, and of the way some operators relied on speed and habit rather than careful military-style security. As he gathered these facts, Bell shifted his attention from opportunistic robbery to the idea of stopping a coach where the road left little room for escape. In his mind, the image of supply trains from the Mexican War fused with the sight of stage teams hauling passengers and treasure through narrow cuttings. He had once watched officers worry about ambushes on those military roads. Now he thought in terms of choosing the ambush positions himself. The early robberies of teamsters and country stores had shown that his men could follow orders. The next step would test whether they could face armed resistance from professional guards and determined passengers. By the middle of 1856, the gang that called him leader had grown from a handful of fugitives into a disciplined group with routines, hideouts, and contacts in multiple camps. They knew which ranches would quietly provide fodder and information in exchange for a share of loot, and which settlements harbored men too nervous to risk any association. They had cached supplies along back trails and agreed on signals to use if scattered by patrols. Among themselves, they spoke of larger, scores ahead with a mixture of hunger and confidence. The countryside, meanwhile, grew tenser. Teamsters traveled in groups more often. Some merchants hired extra riders to shadow their shipments. Families who had once sent loved ones along certain roads without much thought now stood at gate posts watching them leave, uneasy without always being able to say why. The stories of a doctor turned highwayman had not yet settled into a clear narrative in the public mind, But the results of his new life could already be seen in the way people gripped rifle stocks tighter and looked twice at every mask and scarf along the stage routes that wound through the Sierra foothills. By early summer of 1856, the northern mining country lived with the memory of robberies, but did not yet know that the worst act tied to the name Tom Bell still lay ahead. Stage lines rolled daily between river towns and high camps. Dust trailed behind coaches, mule trains, and riders who carried letters, dust, and coin. Men along the roads kept a hand close to rifle stocks and revolver grips, yet in June and July the number of reported holdups dipped, and some travelers began to say that the worst of the road agent trouble had passed. The lull did not come from any new efficiency in county jails or sudden strength in sheriff's offices. It came from Bell himself. After the early string of highway robberies in the hills, he had enough gold to keep his men clothed and armed, but not enough to clear old debts or to set himself beyond want. Small scores from frightened teamsters and country merchants no longer satisfied him. He told his followers that they were risking the noose for sums that vanished quickly in saloons and gambling rooms. If they stayed on the same path, they would end the year no better off than ordinary miners, except that every lawman in several counties would still be hunting them. He began to speak of a different scale of operation, one that would match the largest treasure movements in the region. Stage lines and express companies moved gold dust and bullion from the Yuba and Feather River diggings toward Marysville and then on toward coastal cities. Strong boxes strapped to coach floors or nailed into chests held amounts that no countryside store could match. Guards rode with shotguns across their knees and drivers kept teams moving hard along familiar grades. Bell had watched such operations in earlier years when he rode the same roads as a doctor and gambler. Now, with a trained gang at his back, he considered them in a new light. Planning began in the saloons, boarding houses, and back rooms of the northern camps where gold dust and information flowed together. Bell listened while freighters, mail carriers, and express messengers complained about schedules, broken equipment, and long hours. He and Bill Gristy pushed for details. Which company carried the heaviest boxes? Which route kept to narrow grades where teams could not easily bolt past an obstacle? Which drivers took pride in never giving up a coach, and which ones spoke privately of fear when they heard distant shots on the road? Bits of answers came in fragments over drinks and card games, and Bell stored each piece. Camptonville, perched high above the North Yuba River, figured heavily in those conversations. The town, a mix of rough buildings, tents, and crowded streets, served as a staging point for gold from the higher diggings. Express offices there loaded dust and coin destined for Marysville. A coach that left its small plaza heavy with treasure had to wind down through forest and steep country before reaching the lower town, with long stretches where no settlement stood within earshot. For a man thinking in military terms, those stretches looked much like vulnerable supply lines he had seen in Mexico. Bell needed more than general knowledge. He needed a man inside that flow who could watch departure boards, listen to clerks, and pass along exact information about when a particularly rich shipment would roll. The gang found such a figure in a hanger-on around saloons near Camptonville, a man who made small money running errands for merchants and stage staff, and who had no objection to earning extra coin for reporting what he overheard. Bell did not bring this spy into the full circle of the gang. He set out simple instructions. The man was to watch for word of any stage scheduled to carry an unusual amount of gold dust or bullion, and when he heard it, to ride with that news to a designated meeting place near the road toward Marysville. While that arrangement settled into place, Bell made an unusual decision for a bandit leader who had tasted success. He ordered his men off the roads. No more casual holdups of lone riders or lightly guarded wagons. No more raids on roadside stores. Every such act risked gunfights, arrests, and loose talk. The gang had already drawn attention in the region. A campaign of smaller crimes running up to a major strike would give sheriffs too many chances to catch or scatter them before the big haul. Under his orders, they retreated into the timber and deep ravines between settlements, living on cached supplies and what they could buy quietly in outlying ranches. The effect on the country was noticeable. Notices of new robberies dwindled in the columns of Marysville and Nevada City newspapers. Teamsters spoke with cautious relief at way stations, saying that whoever had been haunting the grades appeared to have moved on. Some credited stronger patrols. Others said that road agents always shifted territory and that maybe they now worked another county. In truth, the same men sat drinking coffee in hidden camps, cleaning weapons and waiting for Bell to say that the time had come to move again. In Marysville itself, life followed hard but predictable patterns. The town thrived as a commercial center with brick businesses near the levees, busy streets of wooden buildings, and a steady traffic of miners on leave from the camps. Among its residents was Robert Tilghman, a black barber whose shop stood near busy foot traffic. Men who worked in the diggings came to him for shaves and haircuts when they reached town, and his chair heard as much talk of strikes, losses, and plans as any barroom. His wife shared his standing in the community, known in black and white circles alike as a capable woman who moved easily among customers, neighbors, and churchgoers. They were part of the social fabric that made Marysville more than a collection of shacks and counting rooms. Neither the Tilghmans nor most townspeople needed to know the details of the quiet search that express managers and sheriffs had begun for leaders behind the earlier robberies. They saw the results in the form of extra guards on some coaches, stricter rules about who rode on top, and hints in newspaper editorials that law officers would not tolerate highway robbery turning into a settled business. Still, without fresh bloodshed, concern stayed just below the level of panic. People had work to do. Wagons had to be loaded, accounts settled, and stages boarded. News of the Tom Bell gang's operations, though muted by the recent lull, continued to flow along the same routes that carried goods and mail. In boarding houses and tents where men gathered at the end of the day, someone always seemed to know a little more. A teamster who had lost a strongbox in the hills described the tall man who gave the orders that night. A miner fresh from Nevada County repeated talk from Rough and Ready about a doctor-turned-bandit who had once amputated limbs in the war and now had men cutting plans for ambushes instead of bone. Each story added another layer to the figure who now moved under the borrowed name Bell. The shock among those who had known him in earlier years traveled more quietly. A few former patients in the interior camps read or heard accounts that matched the doctor they remembered. They recalled a man who had worked through the night over broken limbs and bullet wounds, whose voice had steadied them when they thought they might bleed out or lose the use of a hand forever. Confronted with statements that the same man now placed pistols on passengers and lined the pockets of road agents, they spoke of it in low voices rather than in public. Admitting that they had once trusted someone now charged with highway robbery only deepened their discomfort. Within the gang's hidden camps, Bell drilled his men in the roles they would play when the time came to stop a coach. He used the clear, direct style he had employed in hospital tents, laying out who would approach the driver, who would hold the passengers in place, who would watch the tree line for unexpected riders, and who would move the strongbox once it was loose from the coach floor. He insisted that no man fire a weapon unless absolutely necessary. Each shot was a risk that someone on the road or in a nearby ravine would hear and come to investigate. He reminded them that their purpose was to take gold, not to stack corpses. The men responded in their own ways. Some treated the instructions as a kind of game, reenacting the movements with unloaded weapons and laughing when someone stumbled over a root or slipped on gravel. Others, more aware of what capture would mean, listened with tight faces and practiced each step until they could move into position and back out again without thinking. In private, more than one gang member admitted to another that robbing an ordinary traveler felt one way, but taking on an express coach backed with armed guards carried a different weight. Weeks passed. Messages filtered back from Camptonville that no unusual shipments were yet scheduled. Regular runs carried dust and coin, but nothing that justified the risk Bell was prepared to accept. He kept his men in check with a strict hand, refusing to let impatience push them into smaller jobs that would give up their location for little reward. They hunted for meat, played cards with whatever they had not already gambled away, and waited. The calm of the roads outside mirrored a tense stillness in the camps. In early August, word finally came. The spy in Camptonville learned from talk at the express office that a coach in the coming days would carry a shipment of gold valued at $100,000 packed for transfer through Marysville and onward. Clerks treated the load as routine work. To them, numbers in ledgers had become almost abstract. To Bell, the sum represented a chance to erase the grinding years of debt and failed speculation in one action. The messenger covered the distance down from Camptonville as quickly as a fresh horse would carry him, found the gang at a prearranged hollow in the hills, and delivered the news. Bell did not waste many words on celebration. He fixed the date in his mind and moved immediately to choose ground on the Camptonville to Marysville road that met his conditions. The site had to be narrow enough that a team could not easily turn or bolt past an obstacle. It needed cover close to the road where armed men could stand without being seen until the coach was nearly on top of them. It had to be far enough from any settlement that shots would not instantly bring a crowd, but not so remote that the coach could detour onto another track. After scouting, he settled on a bend where the road carved through brush and rising rock, leaving only a small margin on either side of the ruts. In the days before the chosen coach left Camptonville, the gang moved toward that stretch in small groups so as not to draw attention. They arrived separately at a camp in thick timber above the road, where they buried extra supplies and checked weapons once more. Horses were picketed where they could not be seen from below. Men rubbed dust into bright metal, darkened cloth that might catch the light, and prepared strips of cloth to tie over the lower parts of their faces. Firearms were loaded and then checked again. Every man knew that any stumble now would not just ruin the attempt but might mean a bullet, a cell, or a rope. On the morning chosen for the holdup, the gang rose before full light reached the tops of the pines. Bell went over the plan in a flat tone, pointing to each man in turn as he repeated his assignment. No shouting, no unnecessary words, no shots unless resistance forced it. Take the treasure, take what the passengers carried, and be gone before any organized pursuit could reach that stretch of road. When he finished, he stepped back and looked down toward the muffled rattle of wheels and the faint call of a distant stage horn moving somewhere between Camptonville and the bend that he had marked. The men who had followed him from prison breaks, gaming rooms, and shadowed camps readied themselves beside the road where, before that day ended, the name Tom Bell would move from ordinary fear among travelers to a deeper level of outrage in every town that depended on the coaches running through the Sierra Nevada foothills. Mid-August, 1856. Morning light reached Camptonville in thin bands through dust and smoke as the stage prepared to leave town, and the men handling the treasure treated the day as another hard run rather than as the moment that would fix the name Tom Bell forever in the memory of Marysville. The express office near the small plaza had packed a strongbox for the trip, heavy with gold dust and bullion belonging to a local dealer who trusted the stage line to move his wealth down to Marysville. Clerks had weighed, recorded, and sealed the contents. They wrote down figures that reached $100,000 in value, then closed their ledgers and handed the box over to the men who would strap it to the coach. The numbers meant risk, but to office staff who saw shipments every week, it was one more job in a long list. Outside, the coach stood ready, team hitched and blowing steam in the cool air. The driver took his seat with the reins in hand, a man seasoned by grades, storms, and the constant worry of washed-out sections of road. Next to him climbed Dobson, the express guard assigned to protect the treasure. He wore a shotgun across his knees and a revolver at his side. Years of carrying weapons had taught him to worry less about talk of road agents and more about whether a wheel would fail on a steep descent. Passengers settled into places inside and, for some, on the outside seat. Among them was the woman known locally as Mrs. Tillman, the black wife of Marysville barber Robert Tillman. Her husband's work had made her a familiar figure to many travelers because men who came off the riverboats or out of the diggings often ended up in his chair. She moved through town errands with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in every street she walked. The ride that day would take her along the same route many others used without incident, down toward the lower town where her husband worked and where their routines had taken on the steady pattern of settled life. Beside her on the outside bench, Chinese passengers rode with bedrolls and small bundles. Inside the coach, white passengers shifted to make space, checking their belts and bags. Some carried small pokes of dust, others letters or cash. They knew that coaches had been robbed in the hills before, but they also knew that the guard beside the driver had a reputation for steadiness. Conversation in those cramped spaces touched on mines, business, and the usual complaints about food, lodging, and weather. No one there knew that a man in the timber ahead had already chosen the bend where the coach would meet a ring of guns. The coach rolled out of Camptonville to the sound of wheels on packed earth and the call of the driver to his team. Dobson watched the street edge recede, eyes moving over doorways and corners. Habit made him inspect every cluster of men as they passed. Once the buildings fell away and the route entered the trees, the landscape narrowed to the road, ditches and steep slopes rising or dropping beside them. Dust rose behind and hung in the air, coating clothes and lungs. Ahead of the coach, the gold dust dealer who owned the shipment, often identified as Mr. Rideout, had taken his own horse and ridden in front to escape the choking dust and to reach Marysville quickly. He knew the roads and did not like staring at the back of a coach for miles. As he moved along a lesser-used fork to rejoin the main road farther down, he had no reason to think that his choice would throw off the timing of men who waited with leveled rifles in the brush. In the timber near the chosen bend, Tom Bell and his gang sat their horses in a shallow draw, masked and armed. They had ridden into this position before dawn, taking care to leave little trace near the road itself. Bell had placed 3 men on each side according to his plan so that when the coach reached the bend, gunmen would rise from both slopes at once. Every man knew his position. One was to cover the driver, another the guard, others the passengers. The strongbox under the floor would be the last target, opened once resistance broke. Bell himself watched from a point where he could see the road both above and below the ambush site. His crooked nose, set years earlier by battlefield injury, gave his face a fixed severity that combined with the cloth over his lower features to turn him into something different from the doctor who had once bent over sick beds. His gang knew him now as the man whose orders carried the weight of survival. They had assembled rifles, pistols, and shotguns, checked powder and caps, and listened as he repeated his insistence that weapons only fire when needed. The plan shifted before the coach arrived. The first figure to appear on the track was not the stage, but Rideout alone, riding a horse that the ambushers recognized as the animal they had expected to see behind a cloud of dust. The 3 men on one side of the road saw him before he spotted them. Bell had intended to let the dealer ride past and then take him when the main attack unfolded, but the close distance removed that option. The men moved from cover, weapons ready, and ordered him down from his saddle. He complied, forced by leveled guns. They took his horse, searched his pockets, and pushed him away from the animal. If they had shot him then, there would have been one more body on the hillside. They chose instead to leave him alive and ride off on his horse, believing that this first step had gone well enough. They did not know that he would reach the main road quickly on foot, still close enough to hear the first shots of the main action. Moments later, the coach reached the bend that Bell had marked. Because the half of the gang that had taken Ride out had not yet regained position on their side of the road, the attack began from only one slope. 3 masked men stepped from the brush with weapons raised. The driver saw them and hauled on the reins. Dobson, seated beside him, brought his shotgun up with a movement born from drill and reflex rather than thought. The first blast came from the coach, not from the road agents. Dobson fired directly into the nearest attacker. The shot struck one of Bell's men hard enough to throw him back onto the slope. At that instant, the narrow space between planned ambush and chaotic gunfight collapsed. Bell and the remaining men opened fire on the coach, pumping bullets into wood, metal, and flesh in the attempt to neutralize the guard and force the passengers to submit. What followed lasted only a short span of minutes, but carried a weight that echoed for years. Bullets tore through panels and glass. Shouts from the men in the road mixed with screams from inside the coach. Passengers who carried revolvers drew them and fired through windows in the doorway, adding their shots to Dobson's. Horses reared and plunged under the sudden noise and pain as bullets struck the harness and the animals themselves. Inside, splinters and metal fragments cut through clothing and skin. One male passenger took a round to the head, knocking him back into other riders. Another suffered wounds in both legs as shots punched through the coach walls at knee height. On the outside bench, Mrs. Tillman sat exposed to fire that came from slightly below the level of the wheels. A ball struck her in the head above the right eye with enough force to penetrate the bone and brain. She died where she sat, her body held in place only by the confines of the seat and the crush of movement around her. For Bell's men, the scene offered none of the orderly surrender they had imagined when they planned the ambush. They had expected a coach halted by a synchronized show of force, with frightened passengers handing over valuables while the guard lay still or disarmed. Instead, they faced concentrated return fire from Dobson and multiple armed passengers. Lead cracked past their heads, tore at tree trunks, and kicked up dust. One of the raiders fell with a serious wound. Others felt the air move beside their faces as bullets passed. Bell saw that the plan had broken. The guard, though wounded, continued to fire. The coach still stood within range of other weapons that might appear up or down the road. Continuing the fight on those terms risked his entire gang for a shot at a strongbox that remained out of reach beneath the floor. He shouted orders to pull back, waving his men into the timber. They fell away from the road in small groups, dragging the wounded where they could, leaving behind a churned patch of track, a terrified team, injured passengers, and the lifeless body of the barber's wife. Dobson ordered the driver to push the team forward. The man cracked the reins and the coach lurched ahead, moving past the scene and down the grade toward Marysville as fast as injured men and horses could manage. Blood marked the floor and the boards, mixing with dust and splinters. Inside, passengers tried to staunch wounds with whatever cloth they had. Outside, the body of Mrs. Tillman remained slumped until someone could reach her. As the stage rattled away, the other 3 gang members who had taken Rideout's horse came up the road trailing the stolen animal. They had not been in position when the first shots rang out. Now they saw only dust and heard fading gunfire. Dobson, bleeding from his own arm, still had enough strength to raise his shotgun again. He fired once more, hitting the lead rider and sending him off his mount into the dirt. The remaining men turned their animals and fled. What had begun as a carefully planned multi-angle attack had broken into scattered retreats and sudden deaths. Rideout, back on the main road, saw the chaos in time to recover his horse and follow after the departing stage. The coach reached Marysville with its cargo of wounded and its story. By the time it rolled into town, word had already spread from the first riders who had met it on the road and turned their own animals toward settlements. Men who saw the coach arrive took in the broken windows, blood, and torn wood before they heard any full account. In Marysville, the news of the ambush spread faster than any handbill. The death of a woman who belonged to the town cut through the noise of ordinary business and gambling. In the black community, the shock came with a sharper edge. People who knew the Tilghmans personally, who had shared meals and church pews with them, now learned that she had died not in illness, not by accident, but in the crossfire of a robbery aimed at a gold shipment. Robert Tilghman's reaction carried both public and private weight. As a barber, he had worked with the faces of men who prided themselves on meeting trouble without flinching. His own features, when he heard how and where his wife had died, set in a way that his customers had never seen. Some of those same customers realized that only days earlier they had sat in his chair and spoken of road agents in casual terms, as if such men were distant figures whose actions touched only strangers. Now a murder tied to those same agents had entered the center of their own streets and homes. White townspeople also reacted with fury. Newspapers in Marysville printed the story with words chosen to stir readers. They emphasized that the attack had been aimed at a great sum of gold, that it had failed to gain the treasure, and that the bandits had instead left behind a dead woman and wounded passengers. The fact that the robbers had accomplished none of their financial goal but had still killed and maimed inflamed opinion. Many who had tolerated lesser robberies as part of frontier life now spoke of Tom Bell's gang as enemies to be wiped out rather than as criminals to be arrested. In the mining camps and smaller towns along the stage routes, reaction mirrored Marysville. Men who had once shrugged at tales of holdups now remembered wives, sisters, and daughters who might at some point take seats on the outside of a coach. The idea that bullets could strike those women while gunmen aimed at treasure chests tightened jaws and fists. The death of Mrs. Tillman gave the public outrage a face, a name, and a household that everyone could picture. Among those who had known Bell under his true name, the news struck with an additional twist. A few former patients and acquaintances pieced together that the outlaw leader called Tom Bell with the crooked nose and the air of command was the same man who had treated their injuries years earlier. They spoke of a doctor who had saved limbs, eased fevers, and shown a calm that had once given comfort. Now that same controlled manner had guided men into position around a stage road and sent bullets toward a coach filled with civilians. The mismatch between those roles sat heavily on them. In the hills where the gang scattered after the failed ambush, Bell took stock of what had happened. The strongbox with its $100,000 had gone on to Marysville untouched. His men had suffered deaths and serious wounds. The countryside now burned with anger not only at familiar robberies but at the killing of a woman whose only connection to the gold in the coach lay in the road she traveled. Retreating into the brush, the former doctor knew that the line he had crossed on that August day could not be stepped back over. The robbery had failed in its material purpose but had succeeded in fixing his name to a crime that communities from Camptonville to Marysville would not forgive. Late August 1856 to late September 1856. News of the stage attack reached Marysville faster than written reports could be set in type. Riders who had met the wounded coach near the road carried the story ahead, spurring their horses through dust and heat. By the time the driver turned the battered vehicle into town, people were already gathering near the usual stopping place, drawn by rumor of dead and injured passengers. Men in work shirts left warehouses, clerks stepped away from counters, and women paused in doorways to see what had happened on the mountain road that so many of them had traveled. The sight that met them fixed the anger that would follow. Glass hung in jagged edges from the coach windows. Blood streaked the inside panels and pooled on the floor. Passengers climbed down with torn clothing and bandaged limbs. Dobson, the guard, held his wounded arm in a sling improvised from a strip of cloth. Most arresting of all was the knowledge that one passenger would never descend again. Word spread through the crowd that the body of Robert Tilghman's wife lay on the outside seat, beyond the help of any doctor in town. Inside the Tilghman home, grief gathered with a harsh clarity. The woman who had prepared meals kept their small household in order and walked Marysville streets with assured steps would not return. Neighbors filled the narrow rooms, speaking in low voices, bringing food that no one wanted to touch. The barber sat with hands that had shaved hundreds of faces now hanging still in his lap. Each new visitor who entered the doorway saw not only personal loss, but also a direct link between the talk of road agents that had drifted through the town for months and a body in a house they had entered many times in ordinary friendship. Outside, officials moved quickly. The sheriff and city marshal spoke with Dobson as soon as his arm was bound tightly enough for him to stand. He described the ambush, the masked men, the position of the guns, and the desperate exchange of fire that had driven them off. When they asked whose gang had done it, he gave the name he had already held in his mind from earlier robberies. Tom Bell. The driver backed him in that statement, adding what he could recall of height, bearing, and the number of men who had risen from the brush. Within hours, printers set type for the town paper. Headlines and columns carried the story through every street. Editors laid heavy weight on the fact that the robbers had not taken the gold they sought yet had still left behind a dead woman and wounded men. They called for determined action, warning that if officials failed, citizens would take matters into their own hands. Copies of those sheets traveled upriver, downriver, and along the roads toward the northern camps. In boarding houses and saloons, miners folded the papers with hands marked by picks and shovels, reading the details in packed rooms where every sentence fed new talk. Marysville did more than talk. That night, lanterns burned late in the sheriff's office and nearby stables. Horses were saddled and checked. Weapons were cleaned and loaded. A posse formed from deputies, volunteers, and men hardened by years in the diggings who had seen enough violence to know what waited in the hills. They listened to the route description from driver and guard, then rode out along the road toward Camptonville with jaws clenched and eyes scanning every stand of timber. The first days of the hunt produced no clear path. The ambushers had scattered into the brush immediately after the fight. Tracks diverged, overlapped, and vanished on rocky ground. Pauses from Marysville and neighboring counties rode through canyons and over ridges, stopping at cabins, ranches, and way stations to question anyone who had seen armed men moving in groups. Some residents welcomed them and answered all inquiries. Others, less eager to involve themselves, spoke cautiously or claimed to have noticed nothing. Still, pieces of information began to line up. A group of riders seen near one creek, a wounded man passing through a far camp, a horse traded quickly for another with little bargaining. While the search widened, Bell and his gang huddled in a rough camp far from any standard trail, hidden among pines and boulders. The failed attack had cost them more than the town yet knew. One man lay on a blanket with a torn shoulder and chest, breathing in ragged pulls. Another nursed a shattered arm. Bell used the same hands that had once guided scalpels over clean linen to dress their wounds with strips of cloth, cold water, and whatever basic supplies they had carried. The air held the sour smell of sweat, powder, and blood. Every groan from the injured men reminded the rest that the plan he had laid out in calm tones had broken under the first blast from the coach. Trust inside the circle frayed. Around the small fire, voices rose in harsh whispers. Some blamed the three men who had stepped out early to take Rideout's horse, saying their absence from the main line had left the coach facing fire from only one side. Others muttered that no amount of positioning could have anticipated a guard and passengers who answered with such concentrated fire. The man whose chest had been torn open clutched at Belle's sleeve, demanding to know why they had not pulled back sooner. Belle answered with clipped phrases, insisting that every man had known the danger, that no one could have guaranteed a clean surrender from a coach filled with armed travelers. Gristy watched these exchanges with a face that mixed pain and calculation. He understood, as the others did, that the countryside now carried their names with a particular venom. Ordinary robberies had already drawn attention. The death of a woman from Marysville would turn informal disapproval into a determination to hunt them down. He spoke quietly with one or two men on the edges of the camp, testing their willingness to separate from Belle and disappear into distant regions until the storm passed. Some nodded, worn down by wounds and fear. Others stayed silent, unable to decide whether to break from the man who had brought them this far. Days turned into a grinding pattern. The gang shifted camp repeatedly, never staying long enough for smoke trails or tracks to betray their location. They avoided major roads, watering horses at remote springs and creeks. Belle sent trusted men into small settlements in ones and twos to buy flour, coffee, and ammunition. Each errand carried risk. A familiar face at the wrong time could mean a shout, a drawn gun, and a rope. Yet without those supplies, they would have been trapped in the hills with empty stomachs and useless firearms. In cabins and tents across the northern mines, people who had known Belle before his change in life read the accounts of the stage attack and looked up at one another in stunned silence. A miner who still carried a long scar on his thigh from an accident years earlier remembered evenings when a doctor had sat by his bunk, checking for infection and urging him to keep still. A shopkeeper in a foothill town recalled a man whose manner had marked him as educated, a man who spoke of battlefield hospitals and army service while sipping coffee in a corner booth. Confronted with reports that the leader of the gang now hunted for murder had a flattened nose in the bearing of a former physician, they folded their papers slowly, unwilling to say aloud what they suspected. Law officers in Yuba, Nevada, and Placer counties packed their own feelings into simple actions. They circulated descriptions bearing the name Tom Bell, listing height, build, and distinctive facial structure. They compared lists of known associates, with Gristy's name high among them. They rode in groups through canyons and along streams, pausing to examine campfire remains and to question lone riders. The air in those patrols carried less of adventure and more of grim necessity. Each man knew that anyone they cornered from that gang would fight with the desperation of someone who understood the penalty for highway robbery and killing. Sheriffs and marshals also faced pressure from citizens who had lost patience with slow legal processes. Meetings in Marysville and other towns drew crowds where speakers called not only for capture but for swift punishment. Men stood at the back with arms folded, remembering shots fired at coaches they had ridden in years past, now thinking of the woman whose funeral they had attended. A sense took hold that if the law did not act visibly and effectively, committees of local citizens would. That mood gave officers little room for error. Inside the gang, fractures widened as August gave way to September. One night, a man who had argued most fiercely with Belle over the failed ambush slipped away from camp while others slept. By dawn, his horse and bedroll were gone. Some said he would try to cut a bargain with the authorities. Others said he was simply running for his own life, hoping to vanish into some distant valley where no one used the name Belle at all. His disappearance left the remaining men more uneasy. If one former ally stood in a sheriff's office describing their faces, every camp they had used might already be marked on a rough map. Gristy fell into custody first. Near the end of September, a patrol moving through country west of the foothills encountered a rider whose clothes, weapons, and manner matched what they had been told to watch for. The man made a move for his pistol, but the officers had the advantage of prepared mines and leveled carbines. Within moments, he was disarmed, bound, and headed toward a secure cell. Word that one of Bell's chief companions sat behind iron bars spread with the speed of relief. The jail that received him was a stout building where thick walls trapped the sound of boots and voices but could not completely mute the noise from outside. When townspeople learned that a man tied directly to the stage ambush was inside, they gathered in the street. Some shouted curses, naming the dead woman and demanding that the prisoner see a noose before the sun went down. Others stood with arms crossed, saying nothing, yet making their feelings clear through the weight of their presence. The men guarding the jail understood that the mood outside could shift from threats to action with very little warning. Inside, Gristy faced questions from officers who did not waste politeness. They wanted names, locations, and patterns. They wanted to know where Bell slept, where the gang kept its horses, and who among the settlers or ranchers had helped them. Gristy deflected at first, giving vague statements that satisfied no one. The sheriff, hearing the rumble from the street grow louder, made a pointed choice. He led the prisoner to a barred window and let him hear the volume and tone of the crowd, then told him plainly that the only barrier between that anger and his neck was the willingness of the officers present to hold the line. The message landed. Gristy was no stranger to violence, but he understood the difference between facing individual opponents with guns and facing a mass of citizens whose patience had broken. He looked from the corridor back toward the window, then to the faces of the men questioning him. When he spoke again, the names began to come. He described Bell's current movements, the general direction of the camps, and the fact that the outlaw leader had shifted from the northern foothills toward the valleys near a well-known river crossing used by freight and stock outfits. The information tightened the net more quickly than months of blind searching could have done. As officers in that town sent riders with fresh intelligence toward other jurisdictions, the story of Gristy's surrender of details added another layer to the way the gang appeared in public talk. Around saloon tables, men who had once spoken of Bell's band with a rough admiration for their nerve now said that one of his trusted men had broken and turned informer when faced with a crowd's fury. Some expressed contempt for the betrayal. Others pointed out that the man had been fighting since before the prison escape, and that very few in his position could stare down a lynch-minded street indefinitely. For the people of Marysville and the northern mines, these developments did nothing to soften the memory of the slain barber's wife. For them, every report that a gang member had been captured, wounded, or driven into hiding registered as one step toward balancing that account. They followed each new piece of news intently, watching the map in their minds shift from scattered sightings in the Sierra foothills to a more focused line reaching southward along river crossings and ranch corridors. In their view, the man who had once carried a surgeon's tools with pride now walked a narrowing strip of ground bordered on one side by formal law and on the other by citizens who no longer intended to tolerate his existence. Late September to early October, 1856. When word left the jail that Bill Gristy had named Tom Bell's new ground near the lower rivers, the hunt that had drifted over the northern mines for weeks hardened into a direct pursuit toward the San Joaquin country and the ferry crossing that bore the name Firebaugh. Riders carried the information out of the town where Gristy sat behind iron bars. They followed the valleys westward, then turned south, stopping at sheriff's offices and ranch houses along the way. The picture they drew for the officers they met was clear enough. The leader of the gang that had tried to stop the Camptonville to Marysville stage had left the high country and now moved in the belt of open land and scattered trees along the big rivers. He no longer traveled with the full band that had formed in the northern mines. The gang was broken, but the man who planned their robberies remained at large. In those weeks, the San Joaquin Valley lay dry and wide under a long season of sun. Brown grass reached away toward low hills. Dust lay along wagon ruts and rose in sheets behind every team. The river itself cut a steady path through the plain, its banks lined with willows, cottonwoods, and sycamores. Ferries and fords marked the few dependable crossings for freight wagons and droves of cattle. One of the busiest was Fireball's Ferry, where a simple store, corrals, and a stout cable ferry served the traffic that moved between the interior ranches and the settlements to the west. For a man on the run, that region offered both risk and shelter. The country was open enough that a rider could be seen from a long way off, yet the bands of trees along the river and the side draws leading back toward the foothills held pockets where a small camp could stay hidden from casual view. Bell headed there after the failure on the mountain road, moving in stages from the broken slopes of the Sierra toward the flatter lands where herds grazed and freighters cursed the dust instead of the grades. On the way south, he used the habits he had formed in earlier years. When he passed through a ranch yard or a small roadside stopping place, he kept his voice even and his manner steady. He paid in coin or dust when he could. If someone needed a minor injury tended, he did not refuse. A cut hand, a bad tooth, an ankle twisted under a boot received quick treatment. To those who did not know his face, he could still look and sound like a traveling doctor and former soldier. He gave the name Bell, not Hodges, but to most people in that belt of country, both names meant nothing more than another stranger passing through. Stories of the stage attack still reached the ranches, carried by travelers from Marysville and the northern towns. Men at supper tables spoke of a woman shot from a coach seat and of a gang whose leader had once been called Doctor. Some shook their heads and said that anyone who had taken the oath to treat the sick and wounded had no business pointing guns at passengers. Others said little and listened. When a tall, fair-haired rider with a crooked nose asked for coffee and grain for his horse, they took his money and watched him ride away without asking more questions than courtesy required. By late September, the path that the Stockton authorities held in their minds pointed straight toward the ferry on the San Joaquin. In accounts of the pursuit, a sheriff from Stockton gathered a small group of men and rode south with the intention of taking Bell into legal custody. At the same time, Judge George Gordon Belt, a rancher and former official on the Merced River, heard that the outlaw doctor was moving through the country near Fireball's Crossing. Belt had seen what road agents could do to trade and to families. When word came that the same man whose gang had killed Mrs. Tillman now slept within a day's ride, he did not wait for formal orders. Belt called on nearby ranchers and men he trusted from earlier service. They saddled horses, checked ammunition, and strapped on holsters with the practiced motions of men familiar with sudden trouble. Each knew the stories of the Marysville ambush. Several had seen notes and handbills warning of Tom Bell's height, crooked nose, and habit of giving crisp orders in a calm voice. For them, the hunt did not feel like a distant matter of reputation. It felt like a chance to answer directly for the death on the coach road that had shocked the state. As the posse rode toward Fireballs, they stopped at scattered homes and the few way stations that broke the monotony of the valley. At each stop, they asked the same questions. Had any stranger come through on a tired horse, paying readily and avoiding long talk? Had anyone seen a tall man with a bent nose camping near the river? In more than one place, the answers matched the picture they carried. A quiet rider had passed, had kept to himself, and had followed the tracks that led toward the ferry and the low line of trees beyond it. Fireball's ferry sat at a bend where the river ran deep enough for a boat and slow enough to manage a cable crossing. The store near the landing sold flour, tools, tobacco, and cheap liquor to teamsters and local hands. Pens and corrals held cattle waiting to cross. Freight wagons lined the bank on busy days, their drivers arguing over who would board the ferry first. In quieter moments, the crossing still saw a steady trickle of traffic as men moved goods, letters, and small sums of money across the water. Tom Bell reached that area with the habit of a man who could not relax fully but who knew that a steady appearance helped. He did not ride directly into the busiest part of the crossing and stay in full view. Instead, he kept his camp a short distance away, near a stand of trees and an easy slope down to the river for water. He came to the store to buy provisions and to judge the place. He saw the weight of goods moving over the river, watched the way wagons queued along the bank, and noticed where the storekeeper kept his cash and where the strongest animals were tied. Accounts of the time state that he considered a new robbery in that region. The store at the ferry held money, goods, and the respect of the teamsters who depended on it. Wagons on either side of the river carried cargo and, often enough, small chests of coin. Bell was not yet reduced to simple flight. Even with the full weight of public anger behind the search for him, he still measured prospects and risks in the same way he had done when choosing the bend in the road above Marysville. Nights at his camp near the river were quiet on the surface. The sounds were the steady flow of water, the soft movement of tethered horses, and the distant creak of wagon wheels on the far bank. Around his small fire, Bell took what rest he could, his saddle for a pillow and his weapons within reach. The men who had once gathered around him in rough mountain camps were gone. Some were dead, some in jail, some scattered beyond his knowledge. In the last days near the ferry, he had, at most, one or two rough companions who did not share the history of the goldfields and northern mines with him. They saw only the outlaw leader, not the doctor he had once been. While he measured the ferry and weighed chances, the posse under Judge Belt closed the distance. They came down from the Merced country, crossing dry ground and skirting sinks and sloughs where shallow water still lay. At each ranch and stock camp, they refreshed their information. By the time they drew near Firebaws, they knew that their man had spent days within reach of the crossing. The storekeeper and hands at the ferry mentioned a stranger who matched their description. He had bought supplies, paid in gold dust, and slept in the trees beyond easy sight. Belt listened to these accounts with care, then laid out his approach in plain terms. There would be no wild chase across the plains if he could help it. They would ride in a way that put men both near the ferry and along the likely paths any fugitive might take to escape along the riverbank or toward the distant low hills. Rifles would be kept ready across saddlebows. No one was to fire without a clear target, but no one was to hesitate if Bell reached for a weapon. On the night before the final move, the posse camped not far from the ferry itself, out of sight of the main crossing but close enough to watch lights move in the store and hear faint voices across the dark. Horses shifted and snorted in their picket circles. Men spoke in low tones about the woman from Marysville, about the injuries to the other passengers, and about coaches they themselves had ridden in over dangerous grades. None spoke of turning back. They knew that the search had already cost time, money, and effort across several counties. Letting the outlaw doctor slip away into some other district would mean starting again from the beginning. Bell woke on the morning of 4 October 1856 to another clear valley day. The river moved steadily past the trees. The air held the smell of dust and water mixed together. He stepped away from his bedroll, checked his horse, and prepared whatever simple meal his supplies allowed. At that moment, he did not see any sign of the men who had ridden through the hours of darkness to ring the ground around him. The ferry and the store seemed as they had on earlier days, ordinary pieces of a working crossing. The first sign came in the shape of riders appearing where there had been empty ground the evening before. Men on horseback moved in from more than one direction, their lines not tight but placed with care to cut off the simplest paths away from the camp. They rode with saddles cinched tight, hats low, and weapons where they could reach them without thought. As Bell registered their presence, the gap between him and a clean flight closed quickly. Voices called out across the short distance, ordering him to stand and to keep his hands away from his belt. Those tones carried the assurance of men who had already decided they had the right one. The name Tom Bell came clearly through the morning air, spoken not as a question but as a statement. He saw rifles leveled and knew that any sudden move toward his own gun would draw fire from more than one direction. The men around him were not northern miners or nervous town deputies. They were ranchers and officers from the Central Valley, many of them hardened by years of work, range disputes, and earlier confrontations with thieves and raiders. They sat their saddles without flinching, eyes fixed on the man whose decisions had left Mrs. Tillman dead on a coach seat. In that circle of dust, trees, and river light, the journey that had begun years earlier in Rome, Tennessee, narrowed to a single point. The former Army surgeon, Goldfields doctor, gambler, prisoner, escapee, and gang leader now stood within reach of men who had ridden hard for the chance to bring him down. By the time the sun climbed higher over the San Joaquin Valley that day, Tom Bell no longer traveled under his own will. He sat under guard near Fireball's Ferry, his hands secured, facing a group that had come not only to arrest a highwayman but to answer in their own way for the woman who had died on the Camptonville to Marysville road, early October 1856. The first hours after the capture at Fireball's Ferry passed in a tight circle of armed men and one prisoner who understood that his movements were now measured by other hands. After they closed in near the riverbank and ordered him to stand still, they took his pistols, searched his clothing, and tied his wrists with a length of rope that had already seen ranch work and branding chores. They led him toward a patch of ground within sight of the ferry landing and the store, far enough from the water that horses and wagons could still pass without stumbling over what was about to happen. Men from the posse watched every step. Some had ridden down from the northern counties after months of following rumors about the gang that had tried to strip the Camptonville to Marysville coach. Others were local ranchers who knew the valley and had agreed to ride when Judge George Gordon Belt called. Several had never seen Tom Bell before that morning. They knew him only through printed descriptions, angry editorials, and the story of a dead woman on a coach seat. Now they saw a tall man with sandy hair, a crooked nose, and the bearing of someone used to speaking with authority. They did not take him to a jail. There was none at the crossing large enough for a prisoner whose name carried the weight his did. Instead, they chose a spot near a sycamore tree whose thick limbs stretched out over open ground. The same tree had shaded wagons and cattle on many hot days. Under it, the posse formed a rough ring. A few men stepped aside to hold the horses. Others checked the loads in their rifles once more, not because they expected a fight from a bound prisoner, but because habit and anger pushed them to be ready for any sudden move. Belt stepped forward as the closest thing to an official figure present. He had served as an alcalde and had presided over disputes in earlier years. Now he stood in plain clothes, hat brim pulled low, eyes fixed on the man who had once answered to the name Dr. Hodges. He asked direct questions. Was this the same Tom Bell whose men had stopped the Camptonville to Marysville coach? Had he led the gang that fired on the passengers and left Mrs. Tillman dead and others bleeding on the floor? The prisoner did not pretend not to know what the judge meant. He acknowledged his part in the robberies and in the plan for the ambush, stating that he had not chosen the death of the woman, but that the responsibility for all that had happened rested on him as the leader. There was no formal jury, no clerk writing down each word. The men who ringed the prisoner listened with hard faces. They had not ridden for days to escort him back to a distant courtroom, where lawyers might argue over points that meant little to the families of the dead. They told him as much. This would be his only hearing. The road from the mountain holdup to the sycamore at Fireball's Ferry had ended in this circle, and before the sun dropped, far he would be hanged. Belle asked for paper, ink, and a place to sit. Someone from the store brought a bottle, a pen, and a sheet torn from a ledger. With his wrists freed just long enough to write, he sat on an upturned crate and set the nib to the page. He wrote slowly but without hesitation. One letter was addressed to his mother, a woman who had watched him leave Rome, Tennessee as a young doctor and soldier, and who now, he knew, would learn of his death from lines that described a life far removed from anything she had imagined. He set down that he had disgraced the name she had given him, that his choices had dragged her honor into the dirt of distant roads, and that he faced the punishment at Fireball's Ferry as the price for those choices. When he finished the letter, he folded it with care and wrote her name on the outside in a hand that still carried the training of classrooms and army offices. He penned a shorter note to a friend asking that certain small debts be settled if anyone still cared enough to do it, and that his medical books, if ever found, be given to some young man who would use them honestly. The men around him watched without speaking. For several, the sight of a condemned outlaw carefully forming words to comfort a mother far away sat uneasily beside the picture they held of the same man ordering guns pointed at a stage full of passengers. Before they tied his hands again, he looked up at Belt and the others and asked for the chance to speak. He did not offer secrets about other gangs or hidden caches of gold. He said plainly that he had nothing to reveal that would help them catch further outlaws. He asked instead for a small courtesy. Let him drink once to the health of the men present, and let him hope that they were acting from duty rather than personal hatred. There was no poetry in the way he said it. His tone stayed level, as if he still stood in a ward tent giving instructions to assistants. Someone brought a bottle of whiskey from the store. Belt watched as Belle raised it, nodded to the circle, and swallowed. The prisoner did not curse them, did not plead for mercy. He said that he held no bitterness toward the men who were about to hang him, that the road that led to the sycamore had been laid by his own axe. Then he asked for permission to read aloud the letter he had written to his mother. The posse agreed. Standing under the tree, paper in hand, he read in a clear voice. He named himself as her son, not as Tom Bell, but by the given name she would recognize. He told her that the report of his death would shame her, that he alone bore the blame. He recalled his early years in Tennessee, his service in the Mexican War, and the period when he had still used his medical knowledge only to heal. Then he described, in plain terms, his fall into gambling, theft, and organized robbery. He did not soften the facts or ask her to believe that bad luck alone had brought him there. He said that the woman killed on the coach near Marysville had died because he had chosen a criminal path, and that no apology could restore her to her family. Some of the men listening shifted their weight, not out of impatience, but because the words pressed against their own memories of mothers, wives, and daughters. They had seen crime before and they had seen executions, yet it was another matter to hear an outlaw speak calmly of a woman whose death they themselves had sworn to answer. When he finished the letter, he folded it again and handed it to Belt, asking that it be sent east if anyone could find the means. There was little left to delay the end. Men from the posse tossed a rope over the sycamore limb and tested it with their hands. The noose they tied around his neck was a simple loop, competent rather than ceremonial. He stepped up onto a barrel or box placed beneath the limb. Hands tied behind his back once more, he stood straight, shoulders squared. The dusty ground, the rough bark of the tree, the murmur of the river, and the creak of saddle leather formed the setting for his last minutes. Belt asked one final time whether he had any further statement. Bell said only that he hoped no one present was hanging him from spite, that they were acting because the law had failed to move quickly enough, and that he accepted the outcome. No one in the circle replied. At a signal, the support under his feet was kicked clear. His body dropped, the rope snapped tight, and his neck broke under the sudden strain. Those close enough to see his face noted that after the first shock, there was no prolonged struggle. Within a short span, his body hung still. Later accounts in the valley spoke of a Stockton officer arriving too late to claim the prisoner for a distant court, finding instead a body already swinging from the sycamore at Fireball's Ferry. Whether that man stood in the circle when the rope tightened or rode in afterward, the result was the same. The law in the northern counties and the passions of citizens had met in a stretch of San Joaquin ground and ended the life of the outlaw doctor without waiting for a formal trial. News traveled back to Marysville, Nevada City, and the scattered mining camps by the same routes that had once carried word of the attempted stage robbery. Riders brought the first reports. Newspapers followed with short items and longer accounts. They printed that Tom Bell, also known as Dr. Hodges, had been taken near Fireball's Ferry and hanged there. Some papers mentioned the letter to his mother, noting that he had met death without obvious fear. Others focused on the fact that his gang had never even secured the treasure they sought, yet had still cost the life of a woman and the safety of every traveler who had ridden a coach in those weeks. In Marysville barber chairs, men who had known Robert and his wife read the columns and tried to decide what they felt. There was satisfaction that the man who had led the ambush no longer breathed. There was no comfort in the thought that he had faced the rope calmly. The chair where the barber worked remained the same. The routines of shaving and trimming continued. The empty place at his table at home did not change because the outlaw who had helped cause it had died under a tree by a distant river. For the black community around the Tilghmans, the execution was one step toward justice in a state where their safety on the roads had never been guaranteed. It did not remove the memory of the body brought back from the coach. In the mining camps, reaction had its own layers. Some men who read the news remembered the doctor in his earlier role. They had lain on rough bunks while he dressed their injuries years before, never suspecting that he would become the subject of handbills and wanted notices. They said that the same steady voice that had once told them a limb could be saved or must be taken had later told armed men where to stand along a stage road. Others had only known him as Bell, the outlaw leader. For them, the hanging at Fireball's Ferry was the predictable end to a short, violent career. Express companies and stage lines made their own calculations. The attempt on the Camptonville to Marysville road and the death that followed had forced them to reconsider how they guarded treasure and passengers. After his death, they tightened hiring standards for guards, demanded better weapons, and pressed county officers for stronger patrols along the most vulnerable stretches. Drivers looked more often at brush and bends ahead. Passengers, remembering the stories, checked who sat beside them and where the nearest rifle lay. As years passed, the name Tom Bell settled into books and stories as one among several outlaws of the gold rush era. But the details that stuck among people who had lived through those times were simple and hard. He had been a doctor from a respectable Tennessee family, trained to preserve life. He had served in war, where he had seen more wounded men than most civilians ever would. In California, he had chosen gambling and theft over steady practice, had stolen stock, had escaped from prison, and had led armed men against travelers on public roads. The most remembered act of that path was the ambush that killed Mrs. Tillman. Not any skill he had shown with a scalpel or any nerve he had displayed in front of cannon fire. For the families along the Yuba, Feather, and San Joaquin, his story served as a warning about how quickly a man's standing could turn. Those who had once pointed to him as an example of study and discipline for their sons later spoke his name only as a caution. In quiet moments, some of his former patients admitted to one another that they still felt a trace of the gratitude they had known when he had saved a hand or a leg. That feeling did not erase the anger they carried over the coach killing. It simply showed how deep the shock ran that someone who had walked through sick rooms as a helper had chosen instead to walk the edges of roads as a thief. The sycamore at Fireball's Ferry did not stand as a monument. Wagons continued to cross the river. The store went on selling supplies. Other outlaws in other years tried their own hands at stopping coaches and freight wagons, some with more success than Bell had ever known. Yet among the men who had been present that day in early October and among the families who had followed the case from Rome to Marysville, the memory of the outlaw doctor remained sharp. His hanging closed one life, but the mark it left on the way people in California thought about doctors, gamblers, road agents, and the thin line between them did not fade quickly from their talk or their judgment.